If you're in GI, allergy, or even primary care, you've definitely come across the puzzle that is eosinophilic esophagitis. Today, we're going to break down a really big update to the diagnostic criteria, one that has totally changed how we think about and approach this condition.
All right, let's just jump right in with a super common clinical scenario. You've got a patient who's having trouble swallowing. You do an endoscopy, and the biopsies come back loaded with eosinophils. So you start them on a proton pump inhibitor, a PPI, and on the follow-up scope, poof, the eosinophils are gone. Now, what's the diagnosis? Is it just bad reflux? Is it EoE? For the longest time, this exact situation was a major headache, a real diagnostic gray area.
To really get why these new guidelines are such a game changer, we first have to go back in time a bit and appreciate the old problem. Let's unpack the diagnostic dilemma we were all stuck with.
So here's the classic definition of EoE we all learned in training, right? It's a chronic thing driven by an immune response to some kind of antigen. Clinically, patients have symptoms of their esophagus just not working right. Trouble swallowing, food getting stuck, and the key finding on biopsy, the magic number is 15 or more eosinophils per high power field.
But here was the catch. For years, the official guidelines had this mandatory step baked in. Before you could slap the EoE label on a patient, you had to put them through an 8-week trial of a high-dose PPI. The whole idea was to definitively prove that this wasn't just GERD causing all those eosinophils.
And this created this weird fork in the road. It led to two very similar yet distinct diagnoses. If the symptoms and the eosinophils were still there after the PPI trial, great, you had EoE. But if everything got better with the PPI, the patient was diagnosed with this mouthful, PPI-responsive esophageal eosinophilia, or PPREE. So think about that. We were literally defining two separate conditions based only on how they responded to one type of medicine.
Well, as science tends to do, it moved on. As more and more research came out, this whole framework started to look a little shaky. The entire community started to seriously rethink the role of that mandatory PPI trial.
And this slide really lays out the case against it. First off, researchers found that at baseline, patients with EoE and PPI-RE looked exactly the same, clinically, on scope, even down to the molecular level. Second, we realized that EoE and GERD aren't enemies. They can absolutely exist in the same person. Third, and this is a huge one, we figured out that PPIs do more than just fight acid. They have their own anti-inflammatory effects. And finally, it turned out that patients with so-called PPI-RE also got better with classic EoE treatments like steroids or diet changes. It just became obvious that the PPI trial was creating an artificial dividing line.
And this quote from the consensus paper just hits the nail on the head. Few diseases are primarily defined by response to treatment. It's just not how we do things in medicine, right? And what's worse, by using a treatment as a diagnostic test, we were actually backing ourselves into a corner and limiting the options we could offer our patients right from the get-go. Let's dig into those non-acid effects for a second because they're really cool. We now know that PPIs can directly fight inflammation. They can stop something called the inflammatory oxidative burst. They block a molecule called eotaxin 3, which is basically a chemical siren that calls eosinophils into the esophagus. And they even help heal the lining of the esophagus. So it's not just about the acid at all. Okay, so with all that evidence piling up, it was time for a change. And that led to a completely new, much cleaner, and way more logical diagnostic algorithm. Let's take a look at it. Here it is, the updated algorithm. And the first thing you'll probably notice is just how simple it looks. What's missing? That whole complicated detour for the mandatory PPI trial, it's just gone. This is a much more straightforward path. So for your day-to-day practice, this whole process now boils down to 3 core steps. Step 1, does the patient's story sound like EoE? Step 2, do the biopsies from their endoscopy show at least 15 eosinophils? And step 3, have you thought about and ruled out other things that could be causing those eosinophils? That's it. That's the framework now. And here is the absolute key takeaway. If you remember one thing today, make it this. A diagnosis of eosinophilic esophagitis no longer, I repeat, no longer requires a patient to fail a trial of a PPI. This is the single biggest change to our clinical workflow. Now, just because it's simpler, it doesn't mean we get lazy. We still have to think about those tricky cases, especially GERD and other conditions that can look a lot like EoE. So how do we handle the differential diagnosis now? Well, one of the biggest mental shifts is how we view GERD and EoE. Instead of making them fight it out, like one or the other, the new guidelines embrace the complexity. They recognize that these two conditions can, and often do, coexist in the same patient.
We no longer have to force someone into just one diagnostic box.
And of course, before you finalize that EoE diagnosis, you've got to be a good detective. You have to think about a broad differential. As this table shows, that list includes other eosinophilic GI diseases, motility problems like achalasia, bigger systemic issues like Crohn's, and even simple things like infections or pill-induced esophagitis. You got to make sure nothing else is the primary driver.
So, we've cleaned up the diagnostic process. What does that mean for treatment? How does this new freedom change our very first conversation with the patient about management?
This is a massive paradigm shift. By taking the PPI out of the diagnostic pathway, we've completely reframed its role. It's no longer a hurdle to jump over. It's now officially considered a first-line treatment for EoE, sitting right alongside the other go-to therapies.
And this is so much better for our patients. As soon as you confirm the diagnosis, you can have a shared decision-making conversation about a whole menu of excellent initial options. You can talk about PPIs, swallowed topical steroids, or different dietary approaches, and you can pick the best starting point for that individual patient right there on day one.
And if you're wondering why PPIs got this promotion to first-line therapy, well, this chart tells the whole story. This is data from a big meta-analysis, and look at those numbers. About 54% of kids and 50% of adults had their eosinophil counts get dramatically better on PPIs alone. That's a real, powerful therapeutic effect, and it proves these meds are a fantastic option.
So where does this leave us? This new framework is fantastic. It's clearer, it's more practical, it's better for patients. But it opens up the next big question for the field. We now have this bigger, more inclusive diagnosis of EoE. The next frontier isn't about what we call it, but figuring out who will respond best to which therapy. How can we predict which patient needs a PPI versus a steroid versus diet? That is the next big puzzle we need to solve.